The billionaire was weak in bed. Then his fiancée saw who was caring for him and burst into tears. This happened in front of hundreds of people and nobody saw it coming. A billionaire. A wedding gala with 300 guests. A woman in a maid's uniform holding his hand while he lay there, weak, unable to even sit up. And a fiancée in a red dress, standing in the doorway, hand over her mouth, tears already falling before anyone said a single word. Everyone in that hallway thought they knew exactly what they were looking at. They were wrong. What really happened in that room would leave an entire ballroom in stunned silence by the end of the night, and it started years before that door ever opened. Hey, welcome back to the channel. Before we get into this one, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your country in the comments. I love seeing how far this community reaches. Tonight's story is one of the most emotional ones we've ever told, about money, about pride, about a secret one man carried alone for years, and about a woman nobody in that mansion ever really looked at twice. Stay with me till the end, because this one is going to hit you in a place you didn't expect. Michael Hartwell had built an empire out of nothing, and nobody was allowed to know how much that had cost him. At 34, he was one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country. His name was on buildings in 4 cities. His face had been on the cover of business magazines more times than he could count. He had a mansion outside Charleston with 22 rooms, a fiancée who looked like she'd walked out of a magazine herself, and an engagement gala 3 weeks away that was already being called the event of the year by half the press in the state. From the outside, Michael Hartwell had everything. What nobody knew, not his business partners, not his assistant, not even Vanessa, the woman he was about to marry, was that for the last 4 months, Michael had been collapsing. It started small. A wave of dizziness in the middle of a board meeting that he covered by pretending to check his phone. A night 3 weeks later when his heart pounded so hard and so fast in his chest that he had to grip the edge of his desk just to stay upright, certain for a full minute that he was dying, alone, in an office on the 40th floor of his own building. He never called anyone. He never told anyone. He waited it out alone, the way he'd waited out everything alone his entire life. Michael had grown up in the foster system in Ohio, bounced between 6 homes by the time he was 12, and he had learned early that weakness got you overlooked, or worse, it got you hurt. Strength was the only currency that mattered. He had built his entire life, his entire empire, on never letting anyone see him as anything less than unbreakable. So when a doctor friend at a charity dinner casually mentioned that his symptoms, the dizziness, the racing heart, the sudden exhaustion, sounded like they needed immediate evaluation, possibly a serious cardiac issue, Michael smiled, said he'd get it looked at, and did nothing. Because if word got out that the great Michael Hartwell had a weak heart, 3 weeks before the biggest night of his life, in front of investors, in front of the press, in front of Vanessa's very image-conscious family, he didn't know what it would cost him. And some deep, old part of him, the part still shaped like a scared 12-year-old in a group home, was terrified to find out. He told himself he'd manage it. He told himself 3 more weeks of pretending was nothing. He had no idea that in exactly 3 weeks, in front of hundreds of people, he would no longer have a choice. And he had no idea that the person who would end up holding his life together during those 3 weeks wasn't going to be his fiancée, his doctor, or anyone on his payroll of assistants. It was going to be the quiet woman who cleaned his house 5 days a week, the one whose name he was embarrassed to realize, that night, he barely knew. Nobody at the Hartwell estate really saw Grace Bennett. That was the strange thing about being the help in a house that big. You could be there every single day and still be invisible. Grace was 34 years old, and she had been cleaning houses in one form or another since she was 19. She'd started working for the Hartwell estate 2 years earlier, recommended by another housekeeper who'd moved away, and in that time, Michael Hartwell had spoken to her directly maybe a dozen times, mostly to say thank you in the hallway without really looking up from his phone. She didn't mind. Or rather, she trained herself not to mind, because minding things you can't change was a luxury Grace had stopped affording herself a long time ago. She had a son, Elijah, 8 years old, who had been born with a heart defect that required 2 surgeries before he turned 5 and would likely need a third before he turned 12. She had a stack of medical bills in a drawer in her small rented house that she didn't let herself look at more than once a month, because looking at them more than that made it hard to breathe. And she had a husband who had died 4 years earlier, a man named Daniel, whose photograph she kept in her uniform pocket, folded so many times the crease had worn the image thin at the center of his face. Grace didn't talk about Daniel. Not to her coworkers, not to her son's teachers, not to anyone. It was easier to keep her head down, do her work well, and go home to the one person who still needed her completely. That particular Tuesday evening, Grace was finishing up in the East Wing later than usual because a pipe had burst in one of the guest bathrooms and she'd stayed to help the maintenance crew clear it out. It was nearly 9 at night, the house mostly dark, when she passed by Michael Hartwell's private study on her way to the service stairs and heard something that made her stop cold. A crash. Glass, maybe a lamp hitting the floor, then silence. Grace should have called security. That would have been the normal thing to do. The safe thing. The thing that kept her out of trouble in a house where staff were told very clearly to stay out of the family's private spaces unless summoned. But something in that silence after the crash didn't sit right with her. It was too complete. Too still. She pushed the study door open and found Michael Hartwell on the floor beside his desk, one hand pressed to his chest, his face gray, his lips moving without sound, like he was trying to call for help and couldn't find the air to do it. Grace didn't think. She dropped to her knees beside him instantly. "Mr. Hartwell. Mr. Hartwell, look at me." His eyes found hers, wide with something she recognized immediately, because she had seen that exact look on her husband's face more than once in the last year of his life. Not confusion. Fear. The specific fear of a body that has suddenly stopped listening to the person inside it. "Don't call anyone," he managed to whisper, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "Please, don't call anyone." And Grace, who had absolutely no reason in the world to listen to that request from a man who barely knew her name, found herself doing something she couldn't fully explain even to herself later. She listened. She helped him to the couch, elevated his legs, loosened his collar, and talked to him in a low, steady voice, counting his breaths with him the way a home health aide had once taught her to do for Daniel, until his color slowly came back and his heartbeat, beneath the hand she kept pressed lightly to his wrist, began to even out. It took almost 20 minutes. When it was over, Michael Hartwell, one of the wealthiest men in the country, looked up at the woman kneeling beside his couch with an expression of complete, humbled shock. "How did you know what to do?" he asked hoarsely. Grace hesitated only a second before answering. "Because I've done it before. For someone I loved very much." Neither of them knew yet just how much that sentence would come to mean. The next morning, Michael Hartwell asked his assistant to find out everything she could, quietly, about the woman named Grace Bennett. It felt strange to be doing it. He'd employed her for 2 years and knew almost nothing real about her. But after the night before, after the calm, practiced way she had talked him through what he now had to admit to himself was a genuine cardiac event, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Not in any romantic sense yet, just in the sense of a man realizing he'd been living beside a stranger who had just quietly saved his life. What came back that afternoon stopped him cold in a way no boardroom crisis ever had. Grace's late husband's full name was Daniel Bennett. He had died 4 years earlier at the age of 34 in a house fire in a residential group home in Columbus, Ohio, where he had been working as a night supervisor. According to the report, Daniel had gone back into the burning building a second time after getting the younger children out because a 12-year-old boy had been trapped upstairs, too terrified to move. Daniel had carried that boy out through smoke and collapsed beams, gotten him safely to the paramedics, and then gone into cardiac arrest himself minutes later from smoke inhalation and the strain on an already weakened heart. He died at the hospital that night. Michael sat completely still at his desk, reading that report, because he knew that fire. He knew that group home. He knew that 12-year-old boy, because it had been him. Michael Hartwell had spent 22 years trying, on and off, quietly and without publicity, to find out who the man was who had carried him out of that building the night everything in his life changed. He had asked caseworkers. He had hired a private investigator 8 years ago who came back empty-handed because the group home's old records had been destroyed in the same fire. He had given up eventually, telling himself it was one more thing he'd lost the chance to make right, one more debt he'd never get to repay. And for the last 2 years, the widow of the man who died saving his life had been cleaning his house 5 days a week, and he had never once asked her name beyond what was printed on her employee badge. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study, the same study where he'd collapsed, with Daniel Bennett's old employment photo pulled up on his screen, a young man with a kind, tired face, and he felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition. The next evening, when Grace came by his study to check on him, quietly, the way she'd been doing without being asked since that first night, Michael was waiting for her with the photograph turned around on his desk. "Grace," he said, and his voice wasn't steady. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know I'm not asking to upset you." She looked at the photo on the desk and went very, very still. "Daniel," she whispered. 22 years ago, Michael said, "I was in a group home in Columbus. There was a fire. A man carried me out. I was 12 years old, and I never got to say thank you because I never found out who he was." Grace's hand came up to cover her mouth, and Michael watched tears fill her eyes as 22 years of an unanswered question and 4 years of unresolved grief collided in the space of a single sentence. "That was you," she said. "The boy in the fire." Daniel talked about that night for years. He never stopped wondering if you made it. If you were okay. "I made it," Michael said, his own eyes burning now. "Because of him. I built this entire life because a man I never got to thank gave me the chance to have one." The room went quiet except for both of them trying and failing to hold back tears. "I've been in your house for 2 years, Grace whispered. "I had no idea." "Neither did I," Michael said. "And I am so sorry it took me this long to see you." It took Grace 3 days to fully process what she'd learned, and Michael gave her every one of them without pressure, without expectation, simply grateful and quietly devastated all at once. He didn't tell anyone else. Not his business partners, not his assistant, and, though it sat heavier and heavier on his conscience every single day, not Vanessa. Part of him told himself he was protecting Grace's privacy, giving her space to process a discovery that had cracked open old grief she'd spent 4 years trying to seal shut. But if he was honest with himself late at night, staring at the ceiling of his enormous, empty bedroom, there was another reason too. Vanessa had never asked a single question about his childhood beyond the polished version he gave at dinner parties. Orphan makes good, classic American success story, wrapped up neatly enough to be charming rather than uncomfortable. He didn't know how she'd react to the real, messy truth of that night, of Daniel, of the debt he now knew he owed to the woman who mopped her future in-laws' marble floors. He wasn't ready to find out. Not yet. Not with the gala 3 weeks away and Vanessa's mother already threatening to have a breakdown over the seating chart. So instead, quietly, Michael started doing what he could. He couldn't hand Grace a check. He understood, somehow instinctively, that it would insult the very thing that made her extraordinary. Grace Bennett hadn't cared for him that first terrifying night because she wanted anything from him. She'd done it because it was who she was. So he did it differently. He discovered, through his HR department, that the Hartwell Family Foundation had an existing but underused fund for employee dependents' medical expenses and quietly, without ever mentioning Grace by name in any conversation, made sure that fund was fully activated and that every member of his household staff was notified of it in writing. Elijah's neck surgery, still nearly a year away, would be covered in full, along with every follow-up appointment after it, not as charity, but as a benefit any employee's child would have qualified for, if the fund had ever actually been properly funded and publicized before. Grace found out 3 days later, reading the letter at her kitchen table with her hand pressed over her mouth, and she cried for the first time in longer than she could remember. Not from grief, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of a weight she'd been carrying silently for 8 years finally, partially, lifting. She never mentioned it to him directly. She didn't need to. The next evening, when she came by his study to check on him, a habit that had quietly continued every night since that first collapse, disguised as nothing more than her usual rounds, she simply sat across from him for a moment longer than usual and said, "Thank you for seeing me." "You saw me first," Michael said quietly. Years ago. Through your husband. I'm just finally catching up. Meanwhile, his health was not improving. He'd finally, privately, seen a cardiologist recommended by Grace herself, a doctor who had treated Daniel years earlier and who Grace trusted completely. The diagnosis was serious, a hereditary arrhythmia combined with years of untreated stress and exhaustion, requiring immediate medication, lifestyle changes, and likely, eventually, a minor procedure. Manageable, the doctor said. Not manageable if he kept pretending it wasn't there. Michael promised the doctor he'd tell his fiancée. He promised Grace the same thing. He kept putting it off. Every time he rehearsed the words in his head, Vanessa, I have a heart condition. I collapsed 3 weeks ago. The woman who's been quietly caring for me since is our housekeeper. It sounded, even to him, like the beginning of a scandal rather than the truth. And Vanessa had made it very clear, in 100 small ways over their 18-month relationship, exactly how much she valued appearances. He didn't know yet just how right that instinct was. Vanessa Cole had grown up the way Michael had always secretly envied. Stable, comfortable, one house her entire childhood, parents still married, a name that opened doors before she'd done anything to earn it herself. She was 30 years old, striking, sharp, and very good at making a room feel like it existed for her benefit. Michael had fallen for her fast, 18 months ago, dazzled the way a man who'd never had softness in his life could be dazzled by someone who seemed to glide effortlessly through hers. She'd made him feel, for a while, like he'd finally arrived somewhere solid. But in the 3 weeks since his collapse, something in Michael had started seeing Vanessa differently, not through any dramatic revelation, just through small, accumulating moments that suddenly seemed sharper than they used to. Like the afternoon he mentioned, carefully, vaguely, that he hadn't been feeling well lately, and Vanessa's first question wasn't, "Are you okay?" but, "You're not going to look pale for the photos, are you?" Or the evening he brought up, hypothetically, how stressful the last month had been, and she'd sighed and said the real stress was dealing with her mother's demands about the flower arrangements, before steering the conversation firmly back to herself. He told himself he was being unfair. Everyone got stressed before a huge event. Everyone was self-absorbed sometimes. He was probably projecting his own fear and secrecy onto her. But then there was the phone call. He wasn't trying to overhear it. He'd come up the back stairs toward her suite one evening, planning to finally tell her the truth about his heart, his diagnosis, all of it. He'd rehearsed it that afternoon, sitting with Grace in his study, who had gently encouraged him that Vanessa deserved the chance to show him who she really was. Instead, through the half-open door, he heard Vanessa's voice, low and irritated, talking to her college friend Bree. "I don't know. He's been acting weird for weeks. Distracted, tired, disappearing into his study all the time. No, I'm not worried about him cheating. Please, Michael doesn't have it in him. I'm worried he's sick or something, and honestly, if he turns into some fragile invalid before we're even married, that changes things. I didn't sign up to be somebody's nurse, Bree. I signed up for the life. If the life gets complicated, I need to know that before the wedding, not after." Michael stood frozen in the hallway, one hand still raised toward the door he'd never knocked on. He went back downstairs without saying a word. He didn't tell Grace what he'd heard that night, not directly. But when she found him in his study an hour later, staring at nothing, she didn't need him to explain. She simply sat with him in silence for a while, the way she had learned to sit with grief and fear without needing to fill it with words, until he finally said, quietly, "I don't think she'd stay if she knew everything. I don't think she wants to know everything." "Then she's not the one who deserves to," Grace said gently. "Not everyone gets access to the real you, Michael. Only the ones who've earned it." He looked up at her then, really looked, and understood with sudden, quiet clarity that the woman sitting across from him in a plain uniform, who had earned nothing from him but had given everything anyway, had somehow become the only person in his enormous house who saw him clearly. The gala was 6 days away, and Michael's condition was getting worse, not better. The cardiologist had warned him this could happen, untreated stress compounding on an already strained heart, the kind of thing that needed rest and calm to stabilize, neither of which Michael was getting. buried under wedding preparations, board meetings, and the exhausting effort of performing normalcy for Vanessa and her family every single day. He'd started taking his new medication faithfully, at least thanks to Grace, who had quietly started leaving his morning pills beside a glass of water on his desk each day before the house woke. The same small, practical ritual she used to do for Daniel, muscle memory from a marriage that had trained her painfully in exactly this kind of care. "You don't have to keep doing this," Michael told her one morning, watching her set the glass down. "I know," Grace said simply. "I want to." It was such a small sentence, but it landed somewhere in Michael that Vanessa's 18 months of grand gestures, the designer dinners, the surprise trips, the perfectly staged proposal at sunset with a photographer hidden in the bushes, had never quite reached. Grace wasn't performing anything. She was simply, quietly, choosing to show up. He found himself, more and more, arranging his evenings around the 15 or 20 minutes she spent checking on him after her shift ended, officially confirming the study was locked up, unofficially sitting across from him while he told her, slowly, in pieces, things he'd never told another living person about the group homes, about the years of being moved like furniture from house to house, about building his company alone at 23 with no safety net and no family to call if it all fell apart. Grace, in turn, told him about Daniel, about the early years of their marriage, before Elijah's diagnosis turned every day into a fight against exhaustion and hospital bills. About how Daniel used to say that the most important work in the world wasn't the kind that got you famous, it was the kind that got someone else safely through the night. About how she'd carried that sentence with her every single day since he died, trying to live up to it in a job most people walked past without a second glance. "He'd be proud of you," Michael told her one night. "For everything. For Elijah. For all of it." Grace's eyes filled, but she smiled through it. "He'd be glad you made it out of that fire and built something good with the time he gave you." "I don't think I really started building something good," Michael said quietly, "until a few weeks ago." Neither of them said anything more than that. But something had shifted in the room, something neither of them was ready to name yet, with a wedding still technically 6 days away and a truth still sitting, unspoken, at the center of everything. Grace left that night the way she always did, quiet, steady, closing the study door gently behind her. But this time, Michael sat for a long while after she'd gone, staring at the closed door, understanding with a kind of quiet dread that whatever happened at that gala, he could no longer walk down the aisle pretending nothing in his life had changed. 2 days before the gala, Michael finally worked up the resolve to end things with Vanessa honestly, privately, before the event ever happened. Not as a public scandal, just a quiet, decent conversation that gave them both the dignity to walk away before 300 guests were involved. He never got the chance. Vanessa's mother, Carol, had scheduled a final walkthrough of the ballroom that afternoon, and Michael, exhausted, dizzy from a bad morning, agreed to sit through it because refusing would have raised questions he wasn't ready to answer yet. Halfway through the walkthrough, standing near the floral arch where they'd exchange vows in 2 days, he overheard Carol and Vanessa in a hushed, tense exchange near the catering tables, clearly assuming he was out of earshot, absorbed in his phone. "If you're seriously having doubts, Vanessa, this is not the week to have them. Do you understand what canceling now would do to this family? To your father's business relationships? Everyone who matters is going to be in that room." "I'm not having doubts about the wedding, Mom. I'm having doubts about him. He's different lately. Secretive. If something's actually wrong with him, health-wise, financially, whatever it is, I need a plan. I'm not walking into a marriage where I find out after the fact that I signed up for a burden. Then find out. Quietly. Before Saturday. You have time." Michael stood very still by the floral arch, gripping his phone so hard his knuckles went white, and felt something in him finish breaking that had been cracking slowly for 3 weeks. He didn't say anything. He smiled through the rest of the walkthrough on autopilot, the way he'd learned to smile through every uncomfortable moment of his childhood, and went home that night more certain than ever that whatever happened at that gala, his engagement to Vanessa Cole was already, quietly, over. He just hadn't found the moment, or the strength, to say it out loud yet. That night, his symptoms hit harder than they ever had. Dizziness, chest tightness, a wave of nausea that sent him stumbling toward his bedroom rather than his study, gripping the hallway wall for support, his vision narrowing at the edges in a way that genuinely frightened him for the first time since that very first collapse. He managed to reach his phone before his legs gave out completely, and the only name he could think to call, the only person in that entire 22-room mansion he actually trusted, was Grace. Grace was still in the house finishing a late shift when her phone buzzed with Michael's name, his voice on the other end thin and frightened in a way she'd only heard once before, for years ago, in an ambulance she couldn't ride in fast enough. "I need you," was all he managed to say. She found him on the floor of his bedroom 2 minutes later, worse than that first night in the study, his breathing shallow and rapid, sweat on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning, and every instinct Grace had built over years of caring for Daniel through his own cardiac decline snapped instantly into focus. "Michael, look at me. Stay with me. We're gonna get through this, okay? I've got you." She got him onto the bed, elevated, propped against pillows, checked his pulse, talked him steadily through slow counted breaths while she debated, urgently, whether this was the moment to override every promise she'd made about staying quiet and simply call 911 herself, regardless of what he wanted. She was reaching for her phone to do exactly that when his breathing finally began to slow, his color returning by degrees, his hand finding hers and gripping it tightly. "Don't go," he whispered. "Please. Just stay until it passes." So Grace stayed, sitting on the edge of his enormous bed in her plain lavender uniform, holding the hand of one of the wealthiest men in the country while he came slowly back from the edge of a medical crisis neither of them had told a single other person about, in a house full of caterers and florists and wedding planners 2 floors below, all utterly unaware that the groom was fighting for his breath directly above their heads. She didn't know that downstairs, the final round of gala setup had brought early guests wandering in for a sneak preview cocktail hour Carol had arranged as a publicity moment, or that Vanessa, unable to find Michael anywhere among the crowd and increasingly irritated, had gone looking for him herself, moving from room to room with mounting frustration, finally climbing the private staircase toward his bedroom wing, the one part of the house she rarely bothered to visit these days. Grace didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway until it was already too late to do anything but keep doing exactly what she was doing, sitting beside Michael, holding his hand, speaking to him softly, helping him breathe. The bedroom door opened, and Vanessa Cole, in a floor-length red gown, ready for a cocktail hour she'd assumed her fiancé was simply late to, stood frozen in the doorway, hand flying to her mouth, eyes filling instantly with tears at the sight in front of her. A man lying weak in bed, and a woman in a housemaid's uniform holding his hand with an intimacy Vanessa had never once seen Michael allow her. For one long, frozen second, nobody in that room said a word. Vanessa's tears came fast and loud enough that within seconds, 2 guests who'd followed her curiously up the stairs, including, disastrously, her mother Carol, appeared in the hallway behind her, and within a minute, a small cluster of early gala arrivals had gathered near the open door, drawn by the sound of Vanessa's raised, tearful voice demanding to know exactly what she was looking at. It wasn't quite the hundreds of people that would come later that night. That moment was still building, but word moved through a house full of caterers and wedding staff faster than any of them could contain it, and by the time Michael, still weak but lucid enough to sit up, opened his mouth to speak, a small crowd had gathered at the threshold of his bedroom, phones already, quietly, discreetly, starting to come out. "Vanessa," he said, his voice hoarse but steady, "this isn't what you think." "Then what is it, Michael?" Vanessa's voice cracked, somewhere between genuine hurt and something colder underneath it. "Because it looks exactly like what I think." Grace started to rise, to step back, to remove herself from a situation that was, after all, not really hers to be caught in the middle of, but Michael's hand tightened around hers, and he shook his head slightly, and she stayed. "I've been sick," Michael said, to the room now, not just to Vanessa, his voice gaining strength even as his body remained weak. "For 4 months. A heart condition. I collapsed 3 weeks ago in my study, and I've been having episodes ever since, including one right now, which is why I'm in this bed, and why Grace is the one holding my hand. because she is the only person in this entire house who has cared for me through any of it. You didn't tell me, Vanessa said, and for a moment, genuine hurt flickered across her face. For months, Michael, and you didn't tell me you were sick? I heard you, Michael said quietly. 2 nights ago, on the phone with Bree. I heard exactly what you said about not signing up to be someone's nurse. About needing a plan if something was wrong with me before you walked down that aisle. The color drained from Vanessa's face. And today, Michael continued, I heard you and your mother by the floral arch, talking about finding out quietly before Saturday exactly what kind of burden you might be marrying. So no, Vanessa, I didn't tell you, because some part of me already knew what you'd do with the truth. The small crowd at the door had gone completely silent. This woman, Michael said, turning his gaze to Grace, his voice softening in a way the room could feel even without understanding yet why, found me on the floor of my study 3 weeks ago and saved my life, and she has quietly cared for me nearly every single day since, asking for absolutely nothing in return. And 2 weeks ago, I found out that her late husband is the man who carried me out of a burning building when I was 12 years old and died doing it. I have spent 22 years wishing I could thank that man. I didn't know until 3 weeks ago that I'd been walking past his widow in my own hallway for 2 years without ever really seeing her. Someone near the door audibly gasped. Carol's hand rose to her chest. Vanessa stood frozen, tears still falling, but for an entirely different reason now than the one everyone had assumed when she first opened that door. The engagement gala that night did not go the way 300 guests, a full catering staff, and a small army of florists had spent 6 weeks preparing for. But it became, in its own way, the single most talked about event Charleston society had seen in years. Not for the wedding announcement it was supposed to be, but for what actually happened when Michael Hartwell, still pale, still recovering, walked down to that ballroom 2 hours later on his own 2 feet, refusing a wheelchair despite his doctor's protests, and stood in front of the gathered crowd to say something no one expected. He didn't announce a wedding. He announced the truth, calmly, without bitterness toward Vanessa, without turning the night into a spectacle of blame. He spoke about the fire 22 years ago, about Daniel Bennett, a man most of that room had never heard of, who had walked back into a burning building for frightened, forgotten 12-year-old and given his life so that boy could grow up to stand in that very ballroom decades later. He spoke about finding Daniel's widow, quite by accident, mopping his own floors for 2 years without either of them knowing the debt that connected them. And then he asked Grace, standing quietly near the edge of the room in a simple dark blue dress instead of her uniform, because Michael had insisted, gently, that tonight she stand among the guests, not behind them, to come forward, not as an announcement of romance, not yet, but as a public, long-overdue thank you, in front of everyone who mattered to him, for a debt no amount of money could ever fully repay. There wasn't a dry eye left in that ballroom by the time he finished. Vanessa left quietly before dessert was served, her engagement ring left behind on the table of the private room upstairs, and to her credit, she never tried to publicly spin the story in her favor afterward, perhaps understanding on some level that the truth Michael had spoken that night didn't need her permission to be believed. What grew between Michael and Grace in the months that followed wasn't rushed, and it wasn't built on a single dramatic night. It was built slowly, the same quiet way everything true had always been built between them, on early mornings with pills and water glasses, on late nights in a study talking about the people they'd lost, on a little boy named Elijah who, after his surgery that spring went perfectly, started calling Michael by his first name and, eventually, without anyone quite deciding it should happen, something closer. Michael's heart, with proper treatment and a life that finally slowed down enough to let it heal, stabilized within the year. He liked to say, quietly, to the people closest to him, that it had actually started healing the night a woman in a lavender uniform knelt down beside him on his study floor and refused to leave. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this. The people who show up for you quietly, without applause, without cameras, without asking for anything in return, those are the ones worth building a life around. Not the ones who love the picture you paint for the world, but the ones who stay when the picture falls apart. If this story moved you tonight, hit that like button, Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that real love doesn't announce itself. It just shows up again and again until you finally notice.